All right, so philosophy. What is it? What does it do? Why study it or do it? And where did it start? Well, quick answers to these questions. The love of wisdom, a theoretical discipline, it asks and systematically tries to answer the big questions for understanding and to become a better human being. And Greece. Well, that was easy. But seriously, philosophy, it's literally a love. It's not just a study, as we're going to see today. Its subject matter is wisdom and not truth. Right? Wisdom is more than just knowing the facts. It's knowing what the facts are good for. So, philosophy asks and attempts to answer these big questions that every human being has some sort of a stake in. What kind of beings are we? What's our purpose? How do we come to know anything? What does it mean to be free? How ought we act? Is there a God? If there is a God, how do we relate to him, her, it? What is happiness? Why is there suffering? Etc., etc., etc. So you see, these are the kinds of questions you can't live a human life without having some sort of a stake in asking yourself at some point or another. Right? So philosophy tries to answer these questions by at least first dividing them into three interrelated fields. Right? So if we're trying to figure out what the answer to the question that we're asking for is, we've got to know what sort of a question it is in order to know how to go about answering it. So it's a tripartite decision, at least for ancient philosophy. The three big sections of ancient philosophy are metaphysics, theory of being. Its issues would include questions like the existence of God, the nature of reality, the underlying structure of truth. It basically covers facts that lay outside the realm of sense experience. Right? So epistemology would be the next field, and it's literally the theory of knowledge. So it asks questions like what counts as knowledge? How do we come to know anything? What would even count as knowledge, right? So any sort of criterion for knowing truth would be subsumed under the title of epistemology. And then finally, ethics, right, which is a theory of action, and is concerned with the principles that lay behind how we ought to act and their application. Right? So basically, philosophy asks three big questions. And as simply as possible here, I'm going to try and lay them out in plain language. What's the underlying nature of truth? What's truth? How do we know it? And what do we do about it? Right? So each and every one of the philosophers that we're going to take a look at have some sort of an answer to these questions, because these three distinct spheres or types of question in philosophy are related to one another. What the nature of truth would have something to do and relate directly to how we would come to know it. And if we find that truth is a particular kind of way, for example, that it contains some sort of indication of a moral truth, that would influence our actions. So truth influences how we ought to act. Right? So all three sections or aspects of philosophy are interlinked, and naturally we're concerned with all three and their interplay anytime we try to come to any sort of understanding of philosophy. Now, why are we asking these questions? Aren't we just making our lives harder, more difficult, annoying our friends, having awkward conversations at parties? Why study philosophy? Why do philosophy? Why even ask these kinds of questions? Well, here's my answer. The more we ask these types of questions, the clearer picture of the world we're going to have to work from. Right? Also, by asking these questions, they become a whole lot better at framing the issues that confront us in our lives daily. And we become critical of our own presuppositions or prejudgments. Right? Simply put, by becoming more able to critically evaluate our own actions, we become better at being human. Right? So the things that philosophy does for us, right, it helps us come to an understanding. of our situation in the world as the sorts of beings that we are. Right? And even if it can't come up with a final and absolute answer to these kinds of questions, at least we know what kinds of questions they are and what possible answers might look like. Right? So we've got a better understanding of our situation in the world, or even if we treat this as some sort of intellectual gymnastics, we get better at systematically approaching these issues that do confront us in the world as the sorts of beings that we are. Right? So we think about being human, we become better humans as a result of it. Right? And what's more, we walk around with all sorts of presuppositions in our lives. I don't even know what the presuppositions that I walk around with are. Right? I'm an academic, I've been at this a little while, and I'm trained to critically evaluate presuppositions, but the nature of a presupposition is that we presuppose them. Right? Now, for example, we can look at some of the figures that in the history of philosophy, Aristotle has a famous justification for slavery. He presupposed that slaves were distinct to citizens. Right? They're actually distinct, different kinds of creature. He didn't even critically evaluate that. He didn't even know he had to critically evaluate that. It just had the feel of a fact to it. Right? Now, we can be awful hard on Aristotle until we realize that our own society, only about 100 and some odd years ago, finally stopped legalizing slavery. Right? Our own. And what's more, the ancient Greeks didn't consider women fully human, and therefore they couldn't be citizens. They weren't fully rational. Right? And our own society, only in the past 150 or so years, has come to the same conclusion. We can go at these ancient philosophers' presuppositions, but in 100 years I'd be interested to see what presuppositions were discovered to have. Right? I might not even know I'm being horrible. Right? So, right, philosophy is that discipline that specializes in hunting out these presuppositions and critically evaluating, making the implicit explicit in a way that makes our situation in the world clear to us. Right? So it's a handy discipline. Right? Now, the first philosophers, right, we call them the pre-Socratics. Right? And as the title suggests, pre-Socratic, before Socrates. That's who these guys were. They were the philosophers that came along before the incredibly popular, the first intellectual martyr of the Western world, Socrates. So these were all the guys that came before Socrates. Right? So, the catch is we don't know very much about them. Right? What little we do know comes from fragmentary references within the works of other figures such as Homer, Plato, and Aristotle. That said, we have just barely enough to sketch out sort of a general outline of their positions, enough of one to set up the stage for understanding the intellectual atmosphere and social situation, the scientific crisis that faced the ancient Athenians at the point when Socrates started making his famous arguments in the Agora. Right? So, right, we're going to today set the stage for Western philosophy, as it were. Right? And we're going to do that with perhaps a brief survey of 4 schools of pre-Socratic thought, and then we'll briefly introduce Socrates' generalized position. Right? So the pre-Socratic philosophers that we're going to take a look at are Thales, Heraclitus, Parmenides, and a group called the Sophists, who were in Greece around the 5th century BCE. Right? So, Thales was the first Western philosopher, and every now and again I question why I teach Thales. I have trouble explaining the relevance of Thales to some people. It's really ancient stuff over 2,500 years ago. Right? Thales, the first ancient Greek philosopher, lived from about 620 to 540 BCE.